Tim, you've been talking about God's intentions for business and how valuable it is and to live by these and to carry them out. But what are some of the pitfalls you've seen?
Well, that's a good question. So on the one hand, as a longtime business person, I'm, as you can kind of tell, a huge fan of just how much business can be a great blessing and can serve God's purposes. But I do think it's important to understand there are some dangers. So one of the ones that I think just kind of jumps off the page is the fact that business is about wealth creation. And I mean, that's not the totality of what it's about, but one of the primary outcomes of successful business is wealth creation. And that just inherently poses a risk of kind of greed and materialism. That business people can, especially after years maybe of hard work to get their business to where it's really successful, they can really kind of fall subject to the risks of greed and materialism. And by the way, that's maybe especially easy because of the nature of greed. Most other sins, it's really obvious to us if we're practicing a particular sin. One of my favorite preachers and Christian authors is Tim Keller. And I love this insight from Keller. He said, during all my years of pastoral ministry, I've had people come to me for all sorts of kind of moral failings and sin issues that they wanted to confess and get help with, except greed. He said, I've literally never, ever had somebody show up and say, Pastor, I've got a problem with greed. And he said, there's a reason for that. The nature of greed is it's very subtle and insidious. And we almost always compare ourselves with other people who are more well off and are living more extravagantly and say, well, obviously I'm not greedy because look at them. And so I just would say that one of the risk factors for business people, one of the risk factors, in fact, that it might be really helpful to think about in advance before your business may be generating lots of profit and wealth and so forth, is how are you going to protect yourself against the risk of greed and materialism? And that's also especially important because the spiritual downside of greed is especially large. Essentially, the more self-sufficient we are, the less open we typically are to God and His intended role in our lives. And so honestly, the wealthier we become, often the less we are really kind of eager to listen to God and consider ourselves subject to Him. And so there's a lot of risk factor here, and it's a good thing for business people to take into account.
Earlier you mentioned that you also had some examples. Let's jump ahead to that.
Well,
do you have any illustration of somebody who's seen that and said, hey, I'm going to handle it differently?
I'll tell you, I was totally inspired when I heard this story. So, Barnhart Crane and Rigging. It's run by two brothers, Alan, and I think the other one who I haven't met is Eric. But back in the, I think, mid-'80s, they started this business. Actually, their parents had started it, but it had only kind of grown fairly modestly, and the parents decided they were ready to retire. And so they came and said to the two boys, do you guys want to take this over, or if not, we'll just try to sell it. So both of the boys, who were in their 20s at that point, thought about it and prayed about it and decided, yeah, we do want to take it over. And in a certain sense, kind of relaunched it. They really had to kind of almost start it from scratch. But they were very concerned about the spiritual risks of being in business. They had a choice in a sense. They weren't in business yet. Their parents had been, but they weren't yet. And so they had a choice about, should we go down this pathway or not? And they were very aware that there were some real risk factors. And And the issue of greed and materialism was really one of the primary ones they were concerned about. So they made two decisions. They, in a sense, put two stakes in the ground at the very beginning. They said, one, we're going to determine what an appropriate kind of middle-class lifestyle is economically. In fact, they did that by going to the members of the adult Sunday school class that they were part of at their church. And they just polled them and said, hey, what are you each making? And what does it cost, in a sense, to live your life? And based on all that, they kind of interpolated all that, and they said, okay, a middle-class lifestyle requires X dollars, and regardless of how successful our business might eventually become, if it does, I mean, they had no idea, but we're never going to take any more than that income out of our business, with a little bit of a asterisk to it. They realized that having children would kind of change the expense level, and that there ought to be a cost of living inflator in there. But basically they said, other than those two things, other than a little bump if and when we have a child and an annual inflator, otherwise we're never taking more than this out of the business for our own personal needs. That's a pretty radical thing.
It is.
But they have stuck with that ever since. The other thing that they did, that in a certain sense, though, is even more dramatic, is they said, it's clear to us from Scripture that God owns everything, and that means He owns our business. So here we are, at the launch point, essentially, but we really need, from the very beginning, to see God as the true owner of this business. So they made that specific in two ways. The first way, they said, is every year, we're going to take half of the profits of this business and reinvest it in the business to help it grow. And we're going to take the other half of the profits and dedicate those to essentially Christian ministry purposes, both to fund evangelism efforts around the world and to fund poverty alleviation efforts. They have continued to do that ever since. And that has grown from, in the first year, they had $50,000 to be able to spend that way, and they thought that was amazing. They couldn't believe that that they'd made $100,000 in profit and they had $50,000 to invest in evangelism and poverty-related work. But honestly, over the years, that has just continued to grow, and now for several years they've been at the level where they give over $1 million a month to fund those kind of works. But more recently, as they began to deal with succession issues for the next generation, they said, we do want to allow our children to come into this and play a role in running this now quite large and successful business. But God's the owner, and we really don't want to pass on the economic value of that business to our children as if they're the rightful owners of that. So they literally have taken the entire equity value of the business, and through a trust engineered by National Christian Foundation, donated the entire equity value of the business, which at the time they did this a few years ago was worth $250 million. So they literally just turned that over and said, here, God, this is really your business, so you get all the economic value of it.